at this email. What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or
The
news.
single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Joining me on the podcast today is Josh Weiss, the co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard University and a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. He's also the director and creator of the Master of Science degree in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University. Josh has spoken and published on leadership, negotiation, mediation, and systemic approaches to dealing with conflict. In his current capacity, he conducts research, consults with many different types of organizations, delivers negotiation and mediation trainings and courses, and engages in negotiation and mediation at the organizational, corporate, government, and international levels. He's the co-author of the Emo and Chicky trilogy for children ages 6 to 10 to learn negotiation and conflict resolution skills. He collaborated with William Ury on the best-selling book, The Power of a Positive No, and has recently published his newest book, The Book of Real-World Negotiations, Successful Strategies from Business, Government, and Daily Life, which shines a light on real-world negotiation examples and cases rather than discussing hypothetical scenarios. Thanks for being on the podcast today, Josh.
It's my pleasure, Clint. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with some background. How did you end up in the arena of negotiation?
Well, like most people, it's definitely not a linear path. I sort of started down the road of dealing with conflict, and I tend to be kind of a practical person, and so I kind of quickly gravitated to negotiation because it's one of those really concrete processes for handling conflicts and dealing with lots of different stuff. And so I really started to gravitate in that way, and was doing a lot of work internationally where negotiation is obviously something that gets utilized a whole lot. And as I did this work, I was asked more and more to get involved in all kinds of negotiations, regardless of the level, whether it was government or for-profit, nonprofit, all that kind of stuff. So it's taken on a life of its own. I will say that I just find it fascinating. Negotiation is a very humbling realm. It's very hard to do well, and even when you think you've got it down, you really don't got it down. Because as somebody once said to me, if you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation. They're all different, and they take different twists and turns, even if they begin by looking the same. There's twists and turns because you're dealing with a different person every time, and their idiosyncrasies and all kinds of things like that. But I also love it because it draws on so many different realms as well. There's such an important psychological dimension. There's a, sort of an economic realm. There's lots of fields that intersect with negotiation and feed into it, from reading body language and communication skills. It goes on. And so I think the interdisciplinary nature of it is something also that I find fascinating, and it keeps challenging you to learn more and more.
And you actually teach this as well, right?
I do, yeah, and I love it, and the students love it. When people realize that negotiation is not just something you do if you're in sales or procurement, but it's actually something we do all day when we're dealing with our bosses, we're negotiating, we're dealing with colleagues, we're negotiating. It's one of those tools that we have, and then and then when you go home, you're negotiating with your spouse or your kids, and then in the world around you. So I find that when people begin to realize that, they sort of immediately kind of recognize that negotiation is sort of this life skill that helps you to get where you want to go. And I can certainly say that my life has been a lot different. And the students that I teach, they come out of learning about negotiation with a different view on the world and a different level of confidence.
Well, I used to tell my son, he's 13, he'll be 14 in June, but I used to tell him that he should be a lawyer because he's always litigating with me. But now you need to be a negotiator because that's what he's really doing.
Yep, exactly. I agree with you.
And I know when I first heard the word negotiate, I immediately think of like hostage negotiations or people around a table, lots of coffee and cigarettes, negotiating a business contract. But as you just alluded to, we negotiate many, many more things in our life than just the business aspect or the life hostage kind of a situation, right? There's negotiations, like you said, with business, with your family. So it really is prevalent, and I'm talking about children, but you've written multiple books, including some for children. So what are the Emo and Chicky series about?
So the Emo and Chicky series is actually really all about trying to use stories. When I was a kid growing up, like my favorites were Dr. Seuss and Curious George, and they had a real impact on me in terms of how I view the world and things like that. And when I started to look at what are the books that are written for children out there, I noticed that a lot of them were very how-to. They weren't as much story-based. What I tried to do with my colleague, Greg Relier, was to sort of take stories and embed the skills of effective negotiation in there for kids. So we ended up doing a first book, and it was around problem-solving negotiation, and it was really well received. So we decided to continue on and do a couple more, one on bullying and how do you try to handle that because it's such a challenging situation in our world today for kids. And then the third one was on a sort of a social media conflict between Chicky and Emo, the two heroes to the stories. But we wanted to tell kids that it's okay to conflict with your friends and that you can sort of find a way through that as well if you work at it. And some of those dangers of social media, and to be careful when you post things and think about the consequences of that, which I think a lot of kids don't. So it's a lot of fun, and I really do believe that we've got to get these skills to people earlier. I was recently talking to somebody who I had just taught a course on sort of dealing with conflict, and he said to me, I've been in this field. He was actually an engineer, and he said, I've been in this field for 42 years. He said, I really, really wish I had had your course at the beginning of my career, because I could imagine how much angst I could have saved myself knowing how to do this kind of work and having a strategy for how to handle it. And I think that that's, when I look at people that are my age, 50 and above, et cetera, they never got any of this. And so people are generally left to their own devices to sort of figure it out unless they seek it out. And I think that's part of why we have, some of the problems we've got in our world, because we don't have the ability to talk to each other. And so I hope that we can infuse some of this in our kids, because these relational skills, these transferable skills, as I like to call them, they're in every realm. Where a person exists, if you're going to work in any field, you need this. And it's interesting because I do a lot of work, a lot of public speaking and other things, and it really runs the gamut. I do a lot, for example, in the STEM fields, because people say to me, I'm good at what I do, but when I run up against a person, I don't know how to get them to do what I'd like. And so that's really, when I listen to people and their struggles, it comes down to the people they have to deal with, not their technical ability or things like that. To me, that's negotiation, that's dealing with conflict. And so they're really fundamental skills. And, we're going to be confronted with an AI world and all of those things. But even within that, human beings aren't going anywhere. And so you've got to have the knowledge of how do you do this.
So that series is focused on what age group for kids?
It's about 6 at the young age to 11.
Okay. Maybe my son has already read it and that's how he used it against me. I'm not sure. So you've touched on this answer already, but is negotiation formulaic or is it art?
It's a little bit of both. You can't be too formulaic. I often say to people, if you try to go into negotiation with a plan, which is what a lot of novices want to do, because plans give you comfort, right? If I can go do A to B to C, then hey, I'm good to go, and I know where I'm headed. The problem is that in general, if you try to use a plan, the other person is not reading your playbook, and they don't care about your playbook, and they don't care about your plan, and they're going to do things that don't fit. So that's where the art comes in. So I'm a big believer that negotiation is about preparation. It's not about plans. So Dwight Eisenhower said, plans are useless, but planning is everything. And I really believe that applies to negotiation. Of course, he was talking about war, but I believe that very much applies to negotiation as well. So what you do, and what the way that I train and teach students or folks in companies is to take more of a contingency planning approach to negotiation, that you've got your objective, but then you want to try to come up with 3 or 4 different avenues to get to the same place so that you're prepared. If a curveball comes your way, you can go down a different road. But I have a colleague at Harvard Business School named Mike Wheeler, who sort of talks about an 80-20 rule. And I think it's very accurate. So the 80-20 rule essentially is that you can prepare for about 80% of a negotiation, but there's 20% that's an unknown. And so you've got to be able to kind of think quickly on your feet. In fact, he wrote a book called The Art of Negotiation. And the essence of the book is that you need to learn the skills of improv in order to succeed. So you need to be able to think quickly on your feet. You need to be able to adapt and adjust to information that comes your way. So that's why I say it's both. There's some formulaic pieces to it, and then there's the art form of reading the other, of noticing what's coming back at you, of expecting the unexpected, and learning to think quickly on your feet if you can, to manage what's coming back at you.
Well, the podcast is called The Conversation, and it really focuses on how to talk to people, how to have conversations and dialogues and not just scream at each other across your political divide or your office divide or family divide. And that's why I thought this topic would be so applicable to the people who listen to the podcast. So I saw a TEDx talk you gave called The Wired Negotiator. And in this case, wired does not mean high strung, but technology enabled. In it, you talked about the positives and negatives of text-based communications. And so what are those?
So text-based communications, we're really, texting and email in general. And we often call those low rich mediums because they lack, the context clues and things like that. The thing is, part of the reason I really wanted to do that TED Talk is because when I talk to people about negotiation, they typically say, well, it's always better to negotiate face-to-face. And that actually wasn't my experience because there are a lot of people that find negotiation quite anxiety producing. And as a result, if they're sitting across from someone and that person is yelling or very assertive, that can put off people and cause a lot of challenges for them. And so they can't think clearly and they struggle. And often those kinds of folks just give up whatever in order to reach agreement and to relieve that pressure that they're feeling. When you use email, it's different. You don't have that similar dynamic. And so there's actually a great benefit for people who find negotiation difficult is to use email. But you've got to be really careful because, for example, one of the primary rules of email is basically if it can be misinterpreted, it will be. So right. You've got to go back to people and clarify. You've got to make certain that you understand the downsides of negotiating with email. But I've seen a lot of people that I've worked with over the years who actually find negotiation via email much more beneficial for them. They can step away. They can think through an offer in a much more detailed way than they might otherwise. Usually we make mistakes in the moment, right? When we're being pressured or even when we're asked to sort of agree to something. I know I've had the experience of agreeing to something and a few days later or whatever, realizing that there was another dimension that I hadn't thought about. And I find when you have asynchronous tools like texting and email, that gives you a little more space to kind of make sure that you're clear about the implications of everything. So I really wanted people to realize that, first of all, technology is here to stay. And I did this in 2018 before COVID and before everybody was, using Zoom as their primary means of communication. But I believe technology, and when I ask people who I train or teach or whatever, tell me about your negotiations, like how many of them are face-to-face versus using technology. There's a lot of people who are primarily using technology for their negotiations. So I wanted people to realize that there's a pro and a con to doing that. And if you're going to use email, you've got to be really aware of them, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like recognize that, email can be a really effective way to negotiate for folks who, like I said, feel a bit of anxiety.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of face-to-face communication, but I can definitely see where this would be beneficial. It would give me time to calm down. If I misinterpret the email, like how can he possibly think that? And then I can leave and walk away and come back, an hour or maybe the next day and say, all right, now I've calmed down. Let me answer. So I do think there's definitely some positives there. And for the video aspect, are there positives and negatives on that one as well?
There are. I mean, I think, no question that video mirrors, face-to-face communications in many ways. I mean, there are obviously differences, but you and I sitting across from each other, I can see your facial expressions. I can get a sense of your body language. I can, so it adds a dimension back in that email had taken away. It's not perfect because you don't know what's happening outside the screen and things along those lines. But I think that, I've been counseling, my clients and folks that I work with for many years to use video conferencing because it saves you so much time and effort going, especially people working globally. The trouble and the challenge of traveling halfway around the world for a meeting and the cost associated with it and everything like that, it changes that a lot. And I think it enables people to do a lot of this work in a pretty sufficient kind of way. So I'm a big proponent of it. I also think face-to-face matters and it's important. And yet, I think we should just be thinking about all of these things as various tools in our toolbox that we can use.
Exactly. Yeah, I think of it as just like that, as tools in my toolbox. And for us, at least, we do a lot of global projects. And when we fly over or they fly to us, it's usually for a week to 3 weeks. So it's not just for, I've talked to people who have flown, spent 12 hours on a plane for a 2-hour meeting. Like that's wow. That's just wow. I can't believe that. Yeah. But, we go over for 1 to 3 weeks or they come to us for 1 to 3 weeks and we plan these projects. And what we find is a face-to-face allows us to establish a human connection with those folks that then we can do the rest of the 18-month project remotely, all through video and text-based communication. But that having that face-to-face piece up front was kind of what enabled that. And I look at communication as kind of a continuum. As we were talking about, you have the asynchronous text-based, which is, I like to use it for yes, no answers. So there's limited misinterpretation that can happen. And but there's no tone, of course. And then you go to the phone call. Now you've got the tone of voice, at least you can maybe pick up on the fact the person is getting irritated or angry. And of course, that's the way we always do in the movies on the hostage negotiation is, got to get them on the phone. And then, of course, you go to the video like we were just talking about. And then, of course, face-to-face is the best. But I do think you mix and match to whatever the best option is at that point. Yeah. You also were talking about cross-culturally, and it's just not going to go well, you said, in some places if we haven't met face-to-face at least once. Why is that?
Well, it's exactly what you were talking about. I mean, and I think you hit the nail on the head that there are certain cultures that it's all about the relationship. And I think this, for example, when a lot of Americans were going to parts of the Middle East, for example, Saudi Arabia and places like that, they didn't understand how critical the nature of building a relationship was. People can't do business with you if they don't know you, if they don't know about your family and things like that. And that kind of thing is hard to do over video conferencing or any of the other mediums. So I do believe very strongly that it's worth it to make sure to go and do the kinds of thing you do, which is spend a little bit of time with folks, set the relationship up, and then going forward, you can use these different tools. But it's investing in the relationship. I've seen a lot of different examples where people, when relationship is the core concept when it comes to negotiation, and it's so important to people. They have to know who they're dealing with before they can do business with you. If you do that, it's the kind of gift that keeps on giving, right? It's if people know you, it has a ripple effect. Whereas if you just don't make that effort, you're just never quite going to get there. So I think the way that you're doing it is exactly right. Obviously, that minimizes having to go back and forth constantly. But I think if you make that investment up front, it's well worth it.
Yeah, that's the word we use a lot is the word investment, because that's really what it is. And I'm often, even 30 years into this, I still am surprised sometimes at how deep the connection you can make with someone in just a very short period of time when you're face to face that you may never be able to make if you spend 2 years with them remotely. And it's amazing to me what that eye contact and the I call it the water cooler talk, but it's the conversations you have on the way to get a cup of coffee that have nothing to do with the reason you're together. It's about, hey, what's your background? Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What do your kids do? All that stuff that just, we're not getting that today, certainly on Zoom. And I don't think we're having text-based communications about how's your family, generally deep conversations. So we do find that it is an investment. I think it works really well. Yeah. Now, one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you today is we were talking offline before the podcast started. And I do a lot of project work. And one of the things I find that happens is project managers, team members have really difficult times saying no. So I was really excited to talk to you. And another reason is, frankly, I hate negotiating. I mean, I have friends who love it and they want to negotiate everything. They live their life around negotiations, and I'm the opposite. I mean, I remember I had a situation where my wife gave me 2 tickets to a concert to go see Neil Young. And she didn't want to go because she's not a Neil Young fan, and I couldn't find anybody else to go. So I'm going. And these are by far the worst tickets. I mean, they are literally as far away from the stage as you can get, the top row in the stadium. I mean, they're horrible. So I see a scalper on the street and I'm thinking, all right, maybe I could trade 2 really bad tickets for 1 not so bad ticket. And I said, hey, will you be willing to do a trade 2 for 1? He goes, absolutely. And then he says, oh, and you need me to give me $300. I'm like, no. So I just walk away. And he starts yelling, hey, come back. I'm just negotiating. And I'm like, no, I'm done. Right? I gave you my best offer, which is what I generally lead with. And if that's not good for you, then I'm walking away. And so I get into the stadium, and it ended up working out for me because I got in the stadium and I take my seats, and they really are the worst in the entire stadium. And then a guy comes and sits beside me and he goes, man, these seats suck. And I'm like, yeah, they do. He goes, wouldn't you like to be up front? I said, yeah, I sure would. He goes, I'm with the band. Here's a front row ticket.
No way.
But in general, I just hate negotiating so bad. And I was just hoping that maybe you have some tips and there's some hope for me in all of this. I can I can't learn how to get better at this.
Well, let me ask you a pretty simple question. What is it about negotiation that you don't like?
I always feel like I lose.
Okay.
I feel like I don't feel like it's a win-win. I feel it's like one person wins, the other person loses. Is just how it feels to me.
Yeah.
I know that's different people's styles, and certainly reading the book and other books, it's not how it's supposed to be. You're truly what you're hoping for is a win-win. But I've had some bad experiences where when somebody said it's a win-win, it means they won twice because they won and you lost.
Yeah, that's not quite the definition of win-win. I mean, I think some of that comes back to preparation and really saying, what is it that I'm trying to achieve here? Because I think one of the things that one mistake that people make in general is that they think that the goal of negotiation is reaching agreement, and it's not. It's actually about meeting your objective as best as possible. So in that scenario, you didn't want to pay out of pocket. You already had your tickets. That was the last thing you wanted to do, right? And so your objective was to get a better ticket, a 2-for-1 better ticket, but not to lay out any money. But I think part of it is that if you don't think through, what is it that I'm really trying to achieve here? Like, what are my goals and why is that so important to me? Then it often feels like you're just groping around in the dark, right? You're not really sure what you're aiming at. And so that's part of, for me, that's, when I prepare and when I'm really thinking about it, when I'm clear about my objective, then to me, negotiation becomes something that's really important to me because it gives me the best avenue for getting where I want to go. And so I think also, like when he said, "Hey, come back," that's lots of people play games, and that's the thing, and I spent quite a bit of time working in the Middle East, for example, and I used to negotiate a lot in the bazaars for rugs and whatever. And you always knew you were close when you started to walk away and the guy would call you back. That meant that there was, you were definitely getting close to something that would work for them and for you. It's also being patient with the process. I talk to a lot of people and they say, "Well, I tried to negotiate." And I say, "Well, what did you do?" They say, "Well, I made an offer and they rejected it." I said, "What else did you do?" He said, "Nothing. That's it. That was it." I said,
That's me.
and I said, "You didn't negotiate." Like, negotiation takes persistence. It takes time. It takes also, one of the real keys, and my colleague William Ury, who, you've read his book, The Power of Positive No, but he was one of the authors of Getting to Yes. And, one of the real critical notions in that book was this idea of interest, an underlying interest, and what's most important to people in a given situation. And if you dig down and figure out what are the interests that are really driving me and motivating me in this particular negotiation, and vice versa, understanding what the interests are of the other, that's when you begin to unlock much better deals, because negotiation is all about value. It's about what's important to you. And yes, there's dollars and cents a lot, but there's also a lot of other elements to negotiation. There's a lot of things that people value in many negotiations. Just take a job negotiation, right? If you're going to potentially be hired somewhere, people often, and this is one of the first questions I get asked is, how do I negotiate for a higher salary? And I often will say, well, look, there's certain things that you can do there, but I want you to think more broadly about what else is important in you. Can you ask for flex time? What does their benefits package look like? Do they have daycare? Can you, telecommuting used to be a benefit. I don't know whether it is anymore, but the idea, and like, what's the environment at the workplace? What's the possibility for moving up the ladder? Like, all of those things should be part of your negotiation. But more often than not, people don't raise them because they're so fixated on money that they leave out all these other things that actually have value for them. So I think when you start thinking more broadly about all of this and say, what do I really care about in this situation? You begin to see negotiation as a way of meeting a lot of those different objectives.
Yeah, I do think another reason that I don't love negotiating is it feels disingenuous because I know I have to go with a different offer than I really am willing to accept. So, I'm gonna offer a lower price, knowing that I'm going to come up. And so my attitude is, let me just give you the price I'm willing to pay and walk away. So it just seems much quicker to do it that way. But there is that whole dance that happens where, you give your price, they give their price. You both have gone high or low on purpose so that you can eventually meet in the middle.
I think it depends on the kind of negotiation that you're talking about. To me, that what you're describing is really much more bargaining than negotiation. Like to me, negotiation is much broader. When you
Right.
start bringing in other concepts, other ideas, like I was talking about with regard to the job, then you're getting more into negotiation where you're not so concerned about a high-low way of doing things and that approach, but much more about exploring for what's really important to each side. And I think in particular, when it comes to business relationships, this is key. And I think this is why, Getting to Yes was written in 1981 and it's still on the bestseller list. So we're
Yeah.
talking, right, 40 years later. And there's something, and I know as I've worked more and more with different companies, they essentially have said to me, we need to adopt this interest-based way of doing things because, our best new customers are current one, and we want to keep people with us. And how we negotiate, how we treat them in the process is one big determinant of whether they're going to stay with us. If we take advantage of them and squeeze out, the last nickel, they're going to figure it out eventually and say, do we really want to do this over a 10-year period to, have to sort of go through this every time? Or would we rather take an approach like you're saying, which is, can you help me really understand what matters to you? And I'm going to do the same kind of thing for us because we want to maximize our value here. We want to get not just a good deal, but the best deal. And that only happens when people share information. And that's one of the real keys. I'm a big believer, and you have to do this slowly. I don't just lay out all my information on the table, but I try to test the waters and say, I'm going to share with you something that would be really beneficial to us. And my expectation is you're going to do the same thing because for us, like we can construct a much better deal if we get into that mode. And you and I see this as a long, a long kind of lasting relationship and endeavor, and that we want to work together and we want to do as best for our companies as we can. And when you get there, that's when negotiation provides its greatest benefit, because when you have moved from a distrustful kind of relationship and things like that to a place where folks are actually engaging with each other and trying to come up with the best way forward based on what matters to them, then you start to see real benefit and real change from a negotiation point of view.
Yeah, there definitely were some tips in the book that helped me understand, kind of where I was going wrong. And we were just talking about, you collaborated pretty heavily with William Ury on The Power of Positive No. And I was drawn to that title because of the fact that in the work that I do, so many times people will not say no.
Right.
They'll say yes, either because they truly believe that eventually they'll be able to get it done, or they just hope it will happen and they'll be successful. I was wondering, have you guys done any research around why it's so hard for us to say no as human beings?
Yeah, I mean, in general, we actually did quite a bit of research for the book on that subject. So in general, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One is that people are worried about damaging the relationship. And I think, before we were talking a little bit about engineers and working on projects with engineers. I know I've done quite a bit of work with them. And when they have their initial kickoff meetings with a client, the client will raise things that are not realistic and they won't push back. And I will say to them, why did you not tell them that that's not possible? And they say, well, we wanted to get off on the right foot. And I said, listen, you could get off on the right foot, but you're going to land on the wrong foot by doing that, right? Like it doesn't help you because all you're doing is setting up the table for failure, because when you don't challenge somebody's perspective on what's possible, it's possible, right? That's the problem, is it becomes in their mind, becomes all of a sudden, well, you didn't say no, so it must be yes. So I think people are worried about damaging the relationship. That's the first one. I think the second one is that there are a lot of people who have no problem saying no, but they also leave a bunch of bodies in their wake because they steamroll people as part of it, right? So it's like they'll say no, but in a manner that is humiliating and leaves you, right? And I think it's also, there's an interesting guilt factor to it that in general, we want people to be happy, or lots of people, there are negotiation styles that are out there. And one of the styles is accommodating, right? And accommodators are all about the relationship. And so the last thing they want to do is offend somebody or say something that's going to harm the situation. So I think in general, no is usually received as negative news, which is why in the book we talk about, the positive no is a kind of a yes, no, yes. So, and what that really means is that you start by understanding what's the underlying reason why I want to say no. Because I think the reason that people struggle to say no is they often haven't really thought through, why am I saying no? Like, what is it that I'm trying to protect? What is it that I, am trying to save as a result of doing this? And there is a reason. And I know for me, like, I struggled a bit to say no prior to working on this book. And so when I have to say no, I will say to myself, what is it? What's my underlying yes? What am I saying yes to, so that I have to say no to this person, right? And a lot of time it comes down to, for me, for example, I get asked to do a lot of different things and I don't have the time. I know that if I were to say yes to something, it's just going to overwhelm me. Like, I'm going to be bogged down. And so for me, my underlying yes, the reason why I need to say no is for my own sanity, so that I don't burn out over time, right? And then there's the delivery of the no. And usually, a lot of times when people say no's poorly, it's followed by all kinds of excuses or things along those lines, right? Sometimes the best no is like a clean, simple no. I can't do that. But what we advocate in the book is, and if it's possible, I'm not saying that you always shoehorn every situation into this, but to try to leave something open. So if I go back to my example of somebody asking me to take on a project, right? I know I can't do it because of my workload. But what I will say is, look, because of the fact that I've got 12 projects happening right now, I'm going to have to say no to yours. But when I finished off a few of these and I've got a little more time, like, I'm happy to loop back around and help you out, something along those lines, so that you're true to your yes. The interesting thing is, and I know William talks about this quite a bit in the book, is that in negotiation, you're not wanting to just get to any yes. You want to get to the right yes. And to get to the right yes, you have to say no along the way. And I think that's really important. I think no serves a purpose. And that's the part that I think for a lot of people, they don't understand, or they don't take the time to really grapple with that and say, well, actually, the reason I'm saying no is because I'm trying to protect against this or that. And so there's a purpose here that, and so you have to do, a lot of this is self-talk. We do a lot of negotiating with ourselves. And so, some of it is being worried what's going to happen. But I think there are ways, like I said, to try to make sure that you let the other side know that it's not a personal thing, just that you can't do what they're asking. And then you offer up some other options down the road that might work, might still achieve those objectives.
Yeah, so for people who haven't read the book, it's basically yes, the exclamation point, no period, yes, question mark, yes, no, yes. And it's yes, what are you saying yes to, right? So when I say no to project number 7, I'm saying yes to doing the other 6 on my plate successfully.
Right.
And then the no is, why I'm saying no. And then the yes question mark is you're leaving the thing open. Can I come back at a different time? Or you're trying to make, to your point, the successful yes, the right yes you're trying to get to.
Right. Or could I, for example, offer up a colleague of mine that might have more time, right? There's that yes question mark are creative options that you might put in front of somebody to still try to help meet that need.
Well, that concludes part 1 of my interview with Josh Weiss, author, speaker, researcher, and renowned expert on leadership, negotiation, mediation, and systemic approaches to dealing with conflict. Coming up in part 2 of our conversation, we'll discuss why focusing on compromise when negotiating is a mistake.
People in negotiation tend to be really focused on compromise, and I think that that's a lazy way to negotiate. To me, negotiation is about creativity. The best negotiators that I know and work with, it's all about that. It's about persistence, creativity, and problem solving. That combination is a surefire means to success when it comes to negotiation.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at Amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.